So tonight we're going to talk about Paul and women, and I brought our version of St. Paul to the opening slide. I hope you are all impressed with him, but quite a stalwart character we're going to talk about. So I thought we'd open with the Salutation from 1 Corinthians, and you will see why I chose 1 Corinthians as we go through the presentation. Paul, called to be an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and our brother Sosthenes, to the church of God that is in Corinth, to those who are sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be saints, together with all those who in every place call on the name of Lord Jesus Christ, both their Lord and ours. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So my plan for the evening is to first of all determine which passages to review, and you'll see how that goes as we go. Then to look at both the Greek and the Roman cultures, and particularly how women were treated in those cultures. We need to look specifically at the city of Corinth and what was special about Corinth. And then we're going to read the passage I've selected for tonight. And I chose this passage. There were two. One had 40 verses, and this one had 16. So I chose the one with 16. Then we will look at the writings of a few commentators and then look again at the passage and see how do you see the passage now, if different. So first of all, I started just reading everything I could find about Paul, which, as we know, is a lot. And then one morning it struck me that what I needed was, where are references to women in Paul's writings? And thank you to the Olive Tree Bible app, because it lets you choose Pauline epistles and then put in whatever words you want to search on. So I did a search on woman and women, so you had to do it independently. So on the next slide, I will show you that list, but I color-coded it. So the purple entries are the ones where Paul is referring to a woman, but not giving directions to women. And I'll show you examples of these so you're convinced I chose well. Blue is where it is thought that Paul did not write the letter or the verses, and it's pretty well agreed by many scholars that that is the case. And then black is where Paul is giving direction to women. And then, of course, Steve Chapega brought up prostitutes, and I found a couple of references to them, but they were within other verses, so I did not break them out in particular. So here's our list. And remember, purple is where Paul is referring to women. The next line in Corinthians is black. It's where he's telling women what to do. And then the other color here is blue, where it's thought that Paul did not write it. I've listened to a series of lectures by Richard Rohr, and the one thing he pointed out early on was we don't want to blame Paul for things that he didn't actually write. And so there are some really annoying things in Timothy and Titus, but everybody agrees that Paul did not write them. Interesting, in 1 Corinthians, the chapter 14, verse 34 and 35, have parentheses around them. And every version of the Bible I looked at, 2 or 3, all had parentheses around them. And it's thought that they were added much later, and Paul did not write them. So I've ignored that one as well. So how did I choose, or I'll give you examples just briefly of what these were. So in the Galatians, Where woman appears, it says God sent his son born of woman. So you can see it's not telling us anything, it's just descriptive. Ephesians, render service with enthusiasm as to the Lord and not to men and women. And that could just be translated as people. In Philippians, there's a line with women in it. It says, support Euodia and Syntyche, and and then something like, please support these women. And that I thought was okay. First Thessalonians has, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman. So all of these are really descriptive. They're not Paul telling women how to act differently. These troubling verses in 1 Corinthians is a set of verses we look at and are annoyed at. As in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in churches. This is one of those verses, but it is thought that Paul did not write these, so I have not tonight blamed him for that. So we're really left with just two stories within 1 Corinthians, which I was surprised, and I don't know, maybe you are as well, that because I would have said before I started this work that Paul is against women everywhere, or in many, many, many different places. But it turns out it's only in Corinth. It's only in 1 Corinthians. So something to consider. I was going to do the first reading there, but it's 40 verses. And I thought by the time we read those 40 verses, we can't do much else. So went with the second. So we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 1 through 16. But before we do that, we want to look at the culture of Greek and Roman culture. So in Greek culture, women were to stay at home. I put one of the Greek vases here, this one from the British Museum. You've probably seen a number of them. All the women are very tasteful, they're very well dressed, they're very calm. You kind of see that they're engaged in womanly activities, shall I say, and they are definitely at home. They're not going out much. Now, there are similar vases that maybe you see, but I thought this is kind of a family show, so I would not show you the vases with men, because the men are cavorting with each other in pretty lascivious ways. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to go down that road since we're really just talking about women. But those vases do exemplify that women were to be at home, to be quiet, to be peaceful maybe, and men could go do whatever they wanted to do. So really a totally different culture. Women were not allowed in the Ecclesia. And Rob talked last week, we often think of Ecclesia as church, but in fact, Ecclesia is a community gathering of voting members of the polis. So it's a group of people that are going to make decisions for a particular community. Women were not allowed even to sit in that meeting. And I found two commentators that said if women were found in those meetings, they would be executed. So this is not nicey-nicey. This is, you better stay home, you better shut up, you better stay in your place. So then we go to Rome, and it's really very similar in many ways. Women were expected to be at home and not participate in community life. A couple of the writers at the time were quoted saying the best woman is a silent woman. She should not go out and talk to anybody. And Roman women could maybe get out more than Greek women, but they should not participate in the marketplace or any, outside of the home. So the only people, women who were really out were the priestesses in some of the Roman temples. But men were free to roam and do whatever it was they wanted. The other wrinkle in reading Paul is that there's this single word woman, but it actually referred to many different classes of women, all of whom would wear different attire and would have different social standing. Um, and so highborn women were supposed to wear a veil, and you'll see in some of the commentator narratives that wearing a veil and getting married are the same word in Greek. And so these were the highborn women. They were people that were upstanding. They were married women. They had to be faithful to their husbands, although their husbands didn't have to be faithful to them. But each of these, if I was a slave, if I was a slave out in the field or a slave in a brothel, they all had different clothing requirements. And I guess my last point I've already made, the one word woman, so we kind of look at that and say, well, that means everybody. Well, maybe not. Certainly in the culture, I mean, I think in the end, what Paul wanted was to get some uniformity in the community, but certainly in the culture, woman did not mean a single thing. Now, the other thing about this slide is you see the picture in the upper left-hand corner, this very elaborate hairstyle. And so at this time, there was a new style that highborn women, people with money, would have their hair styled in these very intricate ways. So there was a contentious thing about they did not want to wear a veil because it covered this hair that they had created at great length. The bottom woman is probably certainly in her house. Her hair is down, you can see on her right shoulder. And that would be really verboten for her to go out in that condition. That would never happen. So she was either a slave in a household or a very high class household, obviously. Maybe she was in a brothel. It wasn't really clear who she was, but not going to go out in that outfit. And then the middle one is really what women might have looked at like. So you can notice her hair. It's very intricately braided. She has that little knot on her head. We don't want any flowing hair. Flowing hair was considered to be very sexual. And men looked at women with flowing hair and they immediately were turned on. And that was not what women were supposed to do. But the little veil, very demure, that's what you were supposed to look like. So now why Corinth? Why are these writings just in 1 Corinthians? And so Corinth, we talked about this in the summer actually. Corinth, Philippi, a couple of other of those cities were populated by the Roman soldiers. So there was a huge battle just before this time that was won by the Romans, and they had a huge army in Asia Minor. And so they won the battle, the war is over. What do you do with this army? Well, you don't take them back to Rome. Rome has no food. There's very little farming. There's million people. It wasn't really a million, but a lot of people in Rome, and the agricultural enterprises around Rome could never feed them all, so they depended on importing almost all of their food. So if I moved these army people back to Rome, that wasn't going to be a good thing. Everybody's going to be starving. So we're going to leave them here, and we're going to put them in Corinth. So Corinth went from this Greek city to overnight this amazing Roman city with with these Roman soldiers who are all of a certain class. So there isn't the usual status things going on that you would find in another city that had grown up naturally. You're just importing all these people all of a sudden, and things are in uproar. So the status of women became a real controversy, and we'll see this again later. But we have already seen that there were a number of women prominently involved in the Pauline circle. So remember, in Romans, there are 10 women named at the end of Romans that Paul was working with. We just saw in Ephesians, Euodia and Syntyche, who were named by Paul. So these women exhibited the sorts of status and consistency that would inspire Juvenal to eloquent indignation. Juvenal was a poet, a Roman poet at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, sort of a comedian kind of guy. And a lot of his writing had to do with these women that were getting out of their status. They're not doing it right, and he was making fun of them. But there were women who headed households. There were women who are married, who become converts to this new cult without the consent of the husband. Oh my gosh. Some women have taken on some of the same roles as men's within the sect itself. Some exercise charismatic functions like prayer and prophecy, and some are Paul's fellow workers as evangelists and teachers. So women are very prominent in ways that would violate or go against the culture and the outside world, and people were getting very upset by it. So Sarah Rudin is one of the authors that I used, and she's talking about Corinth. And I have a slide at the end, by the way, that shows many of the resources that I used for this. In the port city of Corinth, with its batteries of prostitutes, including the sacred prostitutes at the Temple of Aphrodite, the distinction between veiled and unveiled woman would have been even more crucial, because all of these men were imported into the city. They didn't have wives with them necessarily. They might have, but they might not have. So prostitution was huge. But on the other hand, society was changing fast. Slaves, in these peaceful times when fewer of them were war captives, were gaining more status and security in households and settling down more often with slave partners. Slaves being freed, divorce proliferating, many more women entering into trades other than the most common trade of prostitution. Any or all of these could have made the veil a matter of controversy. And women not entitled to the veil may have wanted it. And women entitled to the veil may not have wanted it. They wanted to show off their elaborate hairstyle. So kind of all of society is a bit in uproar. And if we know, like in Acts of the Apostles, we hear about Lydia, the purple dye seller. We've heard about the women in Romans. We've heard about other women that are mentioned by name throughout Paul's epistles. And that is really annoying to the culture at that time. So here's our reading, and I'll just go ahead and read it once. And it is 2 screens. If you brought your Bible with you, we're at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 1 through 16. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions just as I handed them on to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. For if a woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, she should wear a veil. For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection of God, but woman is the reflection of man. Indeed, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, but all things come from God. Judge for yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head unveiled? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is degrading to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do churches of God. So the first kind of commentator I want to talk about is Wayne Meeks, who wrote a book called The First Urban Christians. And he has kind of a sense of humor. I loved this line. These are not the most lucid passages in the Pauline letters, and a small mountain of literature about them has by no means relieved their obscurity. So if you were confused by that reading, then you're in good company. We have already seen that there are a number of women prominently involved in the Pauline circle who exhibit their status and consistency, and we talked about those earlier. Women have taken on some of the same roles as men within the sect itself. Some exercise charismatic functions like prayer and prophecy in the congregation. Others are evangelists and teachers. This produced tensions within the groups, and this torturous theological compromise would not settle the issue. So Meeks is saying that, and Paul is trying to solve this problem, but even with this, well, he calls it this torturous theological compromise, that it did not settle the issue. And these writings, including Timothy and Titus, illustrate the variety and the strength of reactions to status inconsistency and violation of conventions of one kind. So this kind, women getting out of place. So we look then at the writing of Sarah Rudin. Traditions and handed on are a noun and a verb from the same word. Literally, the hand-ons, just as I have handed them on to you. We are going to be hearing about custom and authority here. In the Greek, the word head is repeated 9 times in all, 7 in the NRSV. Authority as headship leads into what to do with the physical head. Respectable Greek and Roman women traditionally wore concealing veils in public. Marriage and widowhood were the chief things that a veil signaled. For a Roman woman, to get married and to veil oneself were exactly the same word. The veil was the flag of female virtue, status, and security. And going on from Rudin, Paul's rule aimed toward an outrageous equality. All Christian women were to cover their heads in church without distinction of beauty, wealth, or respectability, or of privilege so great as to allow toying with traditional appearances. The most hurtful thing about bareheaded, gorgeously coiffed wives might not have been their frivolity, but rather their thoughtless flaunting of styles that meant degradation to some of their sisters. Perhaps the new decree made independent women of uncertain status, or even slave women, honorary wives in this setting. And then she says, if all women complied, and later traditions suggest they did, you could have looked at a congregation and not necessarily been able to tell who was an honored wife and mother and who had been forced to service 20 to 30 men a day. This had never happened in any public gathering before. And from the Jewish annotated New Testament, Paul recommends customs consonant with both Jewish and Roman social norms. What is appropriate for women is inappropriate for men, and vice versa. Roman and Jewish priests traditionally covered their heads when in the divine presence. However, non-priests did not cover their head when viewing sacrifices. Paul mandated this non-priestly practice for all males, perhaps to preserve a sense of unity or to avoid pagan associations. So you can see that that what Paul is trying to do here is to really equal the playing field and to have this community, this congregation, be able to do what he trained them to do, which is to worship God, to be an imitator of Christ and to be an imitator of Paul. He starts with that. The second page of this, at least on my slideshow, is all about Genesis, and I'm sure you all picked that up. But when you say a woman came from man, that's talking about the creation story where Eve is created from a rib of Adam. So let me just read this again, and then we will come back together and maybe have a chat. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions just as I handed them on to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head, but any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. For if a woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, she should wear a veil. For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection of God. But woman is the reflection of man. Indeed, man not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, but all things come from God. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head unveiled? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is degrading to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering, But if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. So I'm going to go on to this slide and show you some of the materials that I used in doing this. And then I will stop sharing. We can come back together and hopefully have a conversation. And so go ahead. You should be able to unmute yourselves. So what do you think? Did that change anybody's mind?
Well, here's just a thought. Yes, in this instance, but there are, and I understand, I have to still process that where he talks about obey your husband and all that other stuff that bothers me, that may not be Paul. So I have to process that. So this one I can look at and put that to rest and feel a little better. I have to look at the other things. So I guess it's not unqualified.
Okay. Well, it was a shame to do this one because the 40 verse reading was the one about obey your husband and, and all of that stuff. But go back and read it now that you know more about the culture.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not the other one, and I guess I shouldn't go here maybe, but the other one, he's really hollering at the men. He's not hollering at the women. So when read it again and have a look at it. So Paula, were you going to say something?
No,
You
just
had that.
thinking. Just
Okay.
thinking.
Okay. I saw the wheels turning.
Yeah, good.
How about you, Judy?
I can't say that it changed my mind about Paul. I understand where he lived and the kinds of issues that are going on in the community, but I think he was a product of his time too. I think while he realized that women were followers and many of his followers were women, he was still a creature of his time.
As we all are.
Yes.
As we all are. Yeah, but we can't. Well, I don't know. My point of view
You
is
can't pull him out of you can't pull him out of the universe he lived in.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Carol, you're muted. That's okay. There you go.
I never knew that Lydia was a rebel. I mean, here we have a stained glass window to her and all. And that's interesting to know that actually the way she was acting was causing problems.
Right. Yeah. Well, it was a time of great change. All the commentators really talk about um, that that just thing, especially out here in Asia Minor where Paul is working, there's not a lot of structure, social structure and in place, and then all of these men are really coming into that city, and so it isn't like being downtown Rome where you have the wealthy and the next level and the next level and the next level.
Well, it seems as though he, and I'm still trying to chew my way through this, was advocating, as you said, leveling the playing field, and you could not tell the differences in status by how somebody was, or how their head was covered or not covered. And in the last part of the reading that you had up there, Nancy, it said, "Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head unveiled?" And I can't even, I don't know how to make sense out of the rest of that reading. It doesn't, I'm not sure what the message is. Is it or is it not? I don't know how to.
Well, remember the quote from Wayne Meeks that said, this is not the most lucid
Oh, okay.
passage in the Bible. And there are mountains of writings about these issues. And, and I think a lot of people just have no idea what he was talking about. And there's one, you can get the whole Genesis thing. Oh yeah, he's arguing Old Testament. He's Jewish. That they only have the Old Testament. And it's something about angels.
Yeah, I couldn't figure what that reference was.
Yeah, I couldn't either. And if it's any comfort at all, I could not find anybody that gave a reasonable explanation of what it might have meant. Yeah, crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. How about you, Bertie? Did I convince you of anything?
Well, it seems like some of it's come through, like men are supposed to take their hats off. And I remember when I used to have to wear a veil in church.
Right.
It wasn't in my lifetime you had to. And the reference, I can see where some of the denominations come forward with women shouldn't do this and women shouldn't do that, where some of them, they can't teach Sunday school after a kid's a certain age, and they can't do beyond, it hasn't been so long since we had women on vestries and women in choirs. I mean, this is practically in my lifetime, so it's
Women priests is certainly a
women priests
lifetime.
that was a big hoo-ha back in the day.
Right, right. Yeah. But I don't know, Kitty, go ahead. You're muted. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I've had terrible time trying to stay online with you all. But the pieces I was able to access, it occurred to me the parts that are not attributed to Paul. Is there any way that anyone would know if he knew about those pieces that were put out in his name, if you will?
First and Second Timothy and Titus are thought to have been written in like 90.
Right.
And Paul would have been dead by then.
Exactly.
So I can't blame him for those writings. And there's some of these things we don't love today, in those for sure. But I think it was continuing this in status inconsistency for both men and women. Was an issue. I think from the Jewish annotated New Testament, they're talking about in Jewish tradition, only the priest who was in the Holy of Holies wore a head covering. Nobody else wore a head covering. And so Paul choosing to say, okay, nobody's going to wear a head covering, I think came from that tradition.
Yeah, that's what occurred to me, was that indeed many of these things occurred because of the culture around them rather than what was dictated by any kind of theological thinking.
Right, yeah.
That's what he says at the very end. He says that. That's his last sentence.
Well, I missed the last sentence.
But for anyone who was
contentious,
about this, what is it?
We have no such custom, nor do the churches of God.
Yeah.
right.
So
he's just evidently reacting to some foofara that's going on in Corinth that somebody wrote to him about.
Yeah, in this one, you see it more on the other one. But let me find chapter 7.
It must have been interesting when you figure there was no television, there was no radio. The only way they were in contact with one another would be to have people running back and forth or writing these letters.
Right.
So
So in the
people were tattling on one another, is what it sounds like.
exactly. And so in the verses that are in chapter 7 that we didn't do because there's so many of them, but it starts, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. So, and this is the one about, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. That's the start of that one. And so Paul isn't making this up. He's not saying, I believe this and I'm going to tell you this as a direction. He's responding to a question that's come from the congregation that's led to trouble in the congregation. So he's responding to something rather than, pounding on the desk and saying, you must do it this way. And that really comes across in all of the reading that I did, all of the commentary. And just when you really look at how women were treated outside the church, in both Roman and Greek culture, they were not allowed to speak anywhere. They could talk in their home if their husband liked it. I mean, it was just, that was how it was. And so for Paul to come along and promote all these women to be doing teaching and prophesying and other stuff within the church is scandalous. Kitty?
Well, I wondered, in light of what you were just saying, how in the world did women become priestess?
Oh, that was a whole different track. Then you were a prostitute, really. A high-class prostitute, but a prostitute nonetheless.
Okay.
It was the whole story. And Julian, I see your hand up. I'll come to you in a second. But in the Rudin book, a story about, so if you had a girl child, you probably didn't want them because they were not strong enough, they were not whatever, and they were a girl. Why would you want a girl? So you would put them out on the hillside to expose them and they would die. But there were people, slave traders, who would go around and pick them up and decide to invest enough to get them to an age where they can tell her they're going to be pretty enough. If they were going to be pretty enough, boy, they were going down to the brothel just as soon as possible. If they weren't pretty enough, they were going to work in the fields morning to night and then some. And that's how girls were treated. And everybody thought that was a peachy way to be. So when you look at that and then you read these, you go, well, maybe he's like middle of the road, Julian or Mary Jane?
Yeah, excuse me. I was just going to say that it's even in today's day and age where a lot of us think we're fairly enlightened. There's major denominations who think that Paul said it all, or whoever was writing for Paul said it all, including Rome.
Right. And so I have a handout here, but so Julian had asked the question last week, did women preach? And so I looked up preaching in a couple of books, and Wayne Meeks had a couple of pages on it. I won't read you all the pages, but I'll just read a little bit of this and you'll get the flavor, I think. Because my question was preaching done in these early churches or not? And because there was no ordination, there were no priests, Paul left town, he left us all alone. Who's going to stand up and really do preaching as we know it? So this says, Historians of liturgy commonly assume that the Christian meetings included, from the beginning, the reading and exposition of scriptures, that is, of what the second century church would begin to call the Old Testament. The primary reason for that assumption is the supposed example of the Jewish synagogue. We must be careful, however, not to explain one unknown quantity in terms of another equally unknown. The fact is that extant descriptions of synagogue worship and orders for it are from the New Testament itself or from much later sources. Only by means of small allusions in the writings of Philo and Josephus and a few other writers, and by more or less plausible deductions from the style of these in other Jewish literature, is it possible to guess what synagogue liturgies in the first century may have included. So there was certainly study of scripture, discussion of what that scripture was, but at this point, nobody actually knows, was there something called preaching? And I was quite careful to write down all the words that commentators use. So they use the word teaching, they use the word prophecy. I don't know, I can't remember, but there was not the word preaching anywhere in that. Judy, you had a comment.
Yeah, I thought I picked up that they did celebrate the Last Supper. And who would have led that? I gather because they had a meal and there was some discussion over who ate what kind of food when they got together, and should they all be having the same kind of thing?
But I think
there couldn't have been too many rules about that, though, that early.
I think it was part of the Roman sort of these guilds or societies that they would eat together, and that was to commemorate the Last Supper. And maybe Jay will tell us next week because he's talking about Paul and the Jews. So that sounds like it might be right up his street.
Sorry,
Maybe.
Jay.
We'll see.
But yeah, it is, and Rob has in mind at some point of going through what did Eucharist look like through the centuries, when did it start being celebrated? And I think it was really formally celebrated in a way that we would recognize later.
Yeah.
But I think that
you had to have somebody ordained or somebody with a specific duty and training to lead the Eucharist as we would think of it, I would suspect.
As we would think of it, yeah. But without any priests, I mean, there was it was just.
When did priests start? When did the church start having priests?
Much later. 300, 400, something like that.
Well,
the presbyters are referred to in the New Testament. Various books.
Yeah, but they were like elders, not necessarily priests and ordained.
Perhaps they were rabbis.
Laying on of hands, did they not?
Well, the apostles did, and they were certainly not priests.
What do you mean they weren't priests?
They weren't named priests, were they?
Well, they exercised the function of priest and bishop, certainly.
Did they? When did bishops start?
Later.
I mean, one of the things we have to keep in mind with all of this is from very early on, there were people using today's language, using the language we have now. There were people who would be ordained or set apart to with their various leadership positions, and some of them were called deacons, and I mean James is considered a bishop, and the brother of Jesus was considered a bishop, and so using today's language, there were people who held positions that were reserved for those who had received the laying on of hands and those who were called to lead and be in and kind of oversee, oversee gatherings. But priests, as we would think of them as in charge of as overseeing a congregation, that didn't begin to come until much later, when individual congregations started to come in, and that was not for a couple of centuries before you really started to see that. Early on, it really was the Christians of a community, the Christians of an area would come together and they would gather a lot more informally, even as things were beginning to be recognized. So it's hard to find the word priest in the early writings about the church. It's hard to find a description of somebody who would oversee a specific congregation until those sorts of things began to develop. But there were, from very early on, individuals who were recognized within the Christian community as people of authority and spirituality and other forms of leadership within that.
Yeah, the name, I don't know if you remember back to the opening that I put up that I read, the name Sosthenes was thought to be the congregational leader for the Corinth church. But the other thing I would ask is, we're reading translations. I don't know, even though I look at a number of different translations when I'm reading the Bible, I don't read the Greek. I don't know what the word was in Greek. So I would want to go back and look at, I think the translations end up using language that we know. Oh, people will understand this function. But I don't think it's the same as what we have today. Maybe I'll be proved wrong. Doesn't bother me.
In some ways, the order of ministry that kind of got started first was bishop, was kind of what it was an individual who would oversee a city or a region and and take on the leadership of that large area. That was almost in some ways the first order of ministry that really came, and it was the deacons who would begin to exercise that on a somewhat more local level for the most part.
Right. So, well, I'm reading McCullough, as some of you know, and I'll be starting in the 1st century. So pretty soon I'll report back. But anyway, well, thank you all for coming tonight. It's almost 8 o'clock. And hopefully you got something out of this. And hopefully a few of you have perhaps a slightly different view of Paul. It's still hard to read it today, but I think Julian is right that we have a lot of churches where women, Southern Baptists, I think women can't be priests or ministers. We have a lot of that going on today. So we're not that open-minded, really, even though we would like to think we are. So
if I just can say this at the end, I just realized, if we think back, the world that Paul lived in they were just becoming people of the way, that was just starting. Right. So there was all this, there were the Jews, there were the people who maybe would go along with Paul and say, I'll think about it. And then they were all in different cities where culturally things were changing. And I have trouble with Paul too, but now, especially in light of what you said tonight, maybe he's just trying to wrap his arms around something that he can give, voice to, and somebody's asking him a question and he's really thinking about it. And in his defense, he writes this whole thing, says, okay, so this makes sense now. And if we look at it that way, I think we can be a little bit more forgiving of the
Right.
man.
Right.
Good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, if you have an Audible, is that right? Yeah, Audible account, or you want to get a free trial for 30 days, there's this really great Richard Rohr lecture series. There are 10 lectures. It's not written down. It's only available on Audible, but he recorded it when he says in the series that he's 59 years old. So what is it, like 20 years ago or something? But he's really talking about what you're talking about, Rita, is, he's trying to get people to follow the way, and all of this cultural stuff's getting in the way. How do you get people on track so that they can just follow Jesus? And
They're worried about the veil, and he's trying to teach them about this amazing thing, this person called Jesus. And
Right.
Can't just, and then I'll be quiet. But you said Audible. Is it that Amazon and you just put Richard Rohr in?
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. Yeah, I can, if you can't find it easily, I can send you the name of it.
Yeah, please do, because I do have an account.
Okay. Yeah.
Is the link going to be the same next week as it was this week?
Yep. Yeah, we use the same for this. We use the same link for everything.
Okay, so if I just save what you sent me tonight, I'll get it for next week.
Yeah. And so next week we have Jay talking about Paul and the Jews. And then the following week we have Dr. Tony Lewis.
And I have a blurb from Dr. Tony Lewis right here to read for everybody to know what he's going to talk about.
Oh, okay,
So
good.
after I talk about Paul and Judaism, Dr. Lewis is going to talk about what if Paul was your pastor? Few people in the history of early Christianity have been as controversial as Paul the Apostle. Missionary extraordinaire, motivated by a call to preach the gospel to all, he was an individual who bore the burden of the care of the churches. Who then was this missionary pastor? Using his own words and those of others who knew him, what can we learn about the character of this flesh and blood pastor and proclaimer of the risen Jesus?
And all the work.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Nancy. It was
Nancy.
terrific.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll see you next week, and some of you will see before. Okay.
Am I
Good
going
night,
to be as
everybody.
seriously
Night,
outnumbered
everybody.
next week?